Hey guys, this is JD Phillips from the Appalachian Storyteller, and welcome to this episode of Pickin, Grinnin, and Storytelling. Thanks so much for tuning in, and if you'd hit that like button and share this on your social media and help people find the home of all things Appalachia, I'd be much appreciative. Let's get things started. So tonight, our first story takes place in East Tennessee, up near the Kentucky line in a little place called Coal Creek, Tennessee. Now, this town has had a long history of politicians trying to cash in every possible way that they could. First, by calling themselves Coal Creek when the coal boom first started, and this town sprang up pretty much overnight. So quickly that even though there were all these people that came from all over the world in the city, none of the streets even had names yet. It literally just sprang up overnight. Had 10 businesses in it, and 3 of them were saloons. Now, one man said, shoot, if they're going to have all these saloons, I should be cashing in on it. And this is the true story of how one man built his own town just so he could follow the rules to sell whiskey. And this is a really cool story. It's called Appalachia's Lost City. Hope you enjoy it. Check it out.
I've always admired a man who was willing to take matters into his own hands. The type of man who saw only a worthy challenge while others saw no possible solution. The type of man who was driven from deep within to do whatever it took to achieve his goals, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. These are the type of men that inspire greatness, and I've always studied them closely, hoping to learn from them. This is the story about a remarkable man named George W. Lovely, and the inspirational story of how he created his own town in Appalachia just so he could legally operate a whiskey distillery. That's right. It was the smallest town ever incorporated in the history of Tennessee. Most folks these days don't even know the town ever existed, but it did. And this is the true story of Lovely City, Tennessee. Our story begins in the mountains of East Tennessee. Coal mining had recently begun in the mountains, and there was sort of a gold rush fever in the area. Folks came from thousands of miles from all over the world to try to make their fortune in the coal business. Boom towns sprang up everywhere, and in East Tennessee, the most notable in the area was a place called Coal Creek. Nearly overnight, this town sprang up so quickly that none of the roads in the town even had a name. Yet, it had 10 businesses located right on the main street, and 3 of them were saloons. That's right. The men would spend all day in the coal mines and all night in the saloons where there was a serious demand for that famous Tennessee whiskey. Now, George Lovely, he lived a couple of miles outside of Coal Creek, you see, and he had been operating a water mill, grinding corn, when he all of a sudden got the idea of making his own whiskey to cash in on all the saloons in town. But you see, there was only one problem. It was illegal to make whiskey unless it was approved with a government permit. Oh heck, that's no problem, George thought. I'll just get a permit. Well now, hold on just a second, George. You see, in the great state of Tennessee, you could only apply for a distillery permit if you were operating within the city limits of an official, incorporated town. Now, that's where most folks would have given up. No, but not George. George sprang into action. He began posting signs all over the area, notifying the 17 registered voters that lived in the vicinity of his intentions to create a town. Next, he collected signatures of 14 voters and he drafted a petition for a town charter, and on June 8, 1897, George filed his petition in the Chancery Clerk of Anderson County, Tennessee. He quickly began running advertisements in the local newspaper, notifying the public of his intentions to create a new town. And 13 days later, a referendum was held, and 17 voters cast their ballots in favor of the new town. The official town charter was signed into law by the Tennessee Secretary of State on June 21, 1897. And just like that, Lovely City, Tennessee, was born. Now that George had created a town, he applied for a permit to open a whiskey distillery, and the state of Tennessee granted him a license, registered distillery number 200 in the 2nd District of Tennessee. Now it was time for George to get busy. He hired a couple of helpers, and along with his son, full whiskey production began. At full capacity, George was pumping out 33 gallons of 110 to 115 proof Tennessee whiskey each day. There was even a federal inspector on site to stamp each barrel and to collect the tax each day. Word soon got around about the high quality of the whiskey. You see, George was using pure mountain water that flowed out of the limestone mountain, and it had pooled at the base of a waterfall on his property. He piped in this spring water to his still house, and he had a steady supply of firewood from the mountains that surrounded his operation. Indeed, this was some good stuff. Meanwhile, back in Cold Creek, the miners were paying 10 cents a shot for this whiskey. Heck, he even sold it at bulk prices of $1.50 a gallon. George soon made connections everywhere as far as Louisville and Cincinnati, and he began shipping countless barrels by train under the name of Log Cabin Whiskey. This Tennessee whiskey was so stout that folks in the cities couldn't handle it, and they would cut it down to 100 proof before bottling it and selling it in stores all over. George had done it. He had put Lovely City, Tennessee on the map. It had several houses, a schoolhouse, a post office, a saloon, and several other businesses inside of its city limits. Prohibition finally shut George's legal operation down in 1920, and Tennessee, who was embarrassed by being outsmarted by Mr. Lovely, passed a new law saying that an incorporated town must have at least 1,000 citizens. And just like that, Lovely City came to an end. So here we are, 125 years later, and there's only one original building still standing in Lovely City. However, if you look closely at this area on Google Maps, you'll see signs of the past. The main road in the area is still called Lovely Bluff Road. The creek is still called Lovely Branch. The local water springs are called Lovely Springs. Most folks never even gave a second thought to why this place was so lovely. Yet, somewhere I know, Mr. Lovely is looking down on us, sipping on a glass of Tennessee whiskey and smiling.
I want to sing you just a little bit of this song here. These lyrics right here have a lot to do with this next story. Here we go. Forget your lust for the rich man's gold. All that you need is in your soul. You can do this, oh baby, if you try. All that I want for you, my son, is to be satisfied. So this next story here is called Appalachia's Loneliest House. This is an incredible story. It starts right before the Civil War breaks out, and this man has worked his entire life to build this mansion of his dreams. Civil War breaks out. His whole family is about to go through something that no one ever saw coming. And it's the true story of how you can never judge how happy someone is by the house that they live in. This is Appalachia's loneliest house.
When I was a boy, my dad would always take me riding the back roads. It was during one of these trips that we passed a beautiful mansion in Jefferson City, Tennessee. I told my dad, "Man, I wish we lived in a house like that." And my dad simply responded, "Son, you can never judge a man's wealth by the house he lives in." Well, that was nearly 40 years ago. Yet, if you ever find yourself driving through Jefferson City, Tennessee, chances are that you too might find yourself gazing at this spectacular mansion, sitting high on a hill, and marvel at its beauty and ponder its history. Built in 1868 as a centerpiece of one man's 1,200-acre empire, this mansion has stood for over 155 years as a symbol of power and wealth for all to see. Yet, this story isn't what you might think. In fact, it's a textbook example of how money can't buy happiness, and how you can never judge a man's true wealth by the house he lives in. And so with that, my friends, this is the true story of the Glenmore Mansion in Jefferson City, Tennessee.
Our story begins in 1788, when a family of 9 in Virginia loaded all of their earthly possessions onto a flat-bottom boat, and they floated all the way down to East Tennessee. The area that they settled in was on a creek that was covered with a vivid green moss, so they named the area Mossy Creek. The family opened a mill, and it attracted others to the area, and by 1815, nearly 100 families had moved to the area. Heck, they had blacksmith shops and stores, a post office, and many other businesses sprang up. Yes, sir, Mossy Creek was an up-and-coming community. During the 1830s, zinc mining operations began in the area, and this began to attract many businessmen. One of them was a man named George Branner. Now, Branner was a member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, and he served as a justice of the peace and was a prominent member of the Presbyterian Church. Anyway, Mr. Branner set about purchasing thousands of acres of land in the area, and he opened up a lucrative mercantile store and a grist mill right on Mossy Creek. Now, he operated that mill all the way to his death. However, when he died, his son, John Roper Branner, inherited all of his father's land and his businesses. Now, John was a visionary, and he knew that the more the Mossy Creek community grew, the wealthier he would become. And with that in mind, John made a series of calculated land donations. He donated land to build City Hall, the Presbyterian Church, and a church for the former slaves in the area. He even donated land that would eventually become Carson Newman University. However, his most important land donation was in 1858, when he gave 3 acres to build the Mossy Creek Train Depot. He also gave the railroad that ran from Bristol to Knoxville the right-of-way to run right across his land. The only stipulation he required for this land gift was that every train had to stop at the Mossy Creek Depot. And, as you might imagine, this had a huge economic impact on the area. Heck, it wasn't long before Branner himself was a member of the board of directors for the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. So,
Mr. Branner decided that he would build a mansion that East Tennessee had never seen the likes of before. A 3-story mansion with a huge tower where he could stand and overlook the kingdom he had created. John mobilized his 50 slaves and he set about firing the bricks that were needed for the 8,000 square foot mansion. Yet, no sooner than he had started, the Civil War broke out in 1861. His mansion would have to wait. For the next 4 years, the Civil War tore America apart. On December 29, 1863, the war came to Mossy Creek. Union and Confederate forces clashed at 9 a.m. in the morning. The battle raged throughout the day. And by nightfall, more than 500 men had lost their life in the Battle of Mossy Creek. Now, John Branner had spent the majority of the Civil War focusing on keeping the railroad open so that supplies could continue being shipped, and many considered him a hero. His actions resulted in him being named the president of the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. With the dark days of the Civil War behind him, John returned his focus on fulfilling his dream of building an 8,000 square foot mansion he would call the Oaks. Construction began in 1867, and it was completed in 1868. However, tragically, John suffered a stroke at the age of 47, and he died. He never slept a single night in the mansion. The old saying, "Money can't buy happiness," comes to my mind as I stop and I think about that. You see, John Roper was a millionaire by today's standards. He was on top of the world financially. He was one of the most respected businessmen in the southern United States. However, in his private life, he was a tormented man. He had fathered 8 children, and tragically, 6 of them had died before they reached age 6. And his oldest son was just 19 when he died of typhoid fever while enlisted as a soldier in the Civil War. That's right, only 1 child survived. And for the next 13 years, John's widow, Deborah, and her only surviving son lived in the mansion. Eventually, Miss Branner picked up the pieces and, with the help of her late husband's brother, they opened a school inside of the mansion for young ladies. The school was a finishing school of sorts, to teach aspiring ladies seeking husbands the art of conversation and music and art, Latin, math, and further refinement. The school operated until 1879 inside of the mansion. By 1882, Miss Branner's health had begun to decline. She had lost everything in the world that she loved, and she was a prisoner in her Victorian mansion. It was too much for her to bear, so she sold the property, and just 3 years later, she died. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Miss Branner to live all alone in her dream home, 8,000 square feet and 27 rooms of Victorian elegance, all of the earthly possessions that money could buy? Yet she was all alone, and she had lost everything in the world that she loved. Her husband had spent his whole life devoted to building this home for their family, yet their dreams met a tragic fate. No, sir, you can never judge a man's wealth by the house he lives in. The irony of this story is that when Miss Branner finally sold the home due to her broken heart, it was bought by a lawyer named Milton Jarnigan. Now, Mr. Jarnigan and his family would live in this home and raise a happy, healthy family for the next 83 years.
Hey guys, JD here from the Appalachian Storyteller, here with you live on Pickin, Grinnin, and Storytelling. Thanks for stopping in with us tonight. I want to play another one for you. See if you can pick this one out. Well, the preacher man says it's the end of time. Mississippi River, she's a-going dry. Yeah, the interest is up and the stock market's down. You only get mugged if you go downtown. Well, I live back in the woods, you see. A woman and the kids and the dogs and me. Got a shotgun and a rifle and a four-wheel drive. Country boy can survive. Country folks can survive. Boy, that takes me back to when I was a kid, man. My dad had this 68 Camaro, and it was maroon, and good Lord, man. I don't know if it was the fastest car ever, but when I was a kid, sitting in the back seat on that transmission hump, leaning on those bucket seats, and he was jamming that Craco radio with Hank Williams Jr., man, that was good living back in the day. Anyways, our next story here, this is a story. Let me ask you this. If you had to say, what is the best television show of all time, what would you say? Well, for me, I would have to say it was the Andy Griffith Show. I remember that show every night, man. We would get home and as kids doing our homework, then play outside till dark. When we came in, Sanford and Son was on, and right after that, it was the Andy Griffith Show on Superstation TBS coming in out of Atlanta is what we picked up. And what a wholesome show. I still watch it today. You know, a lot of folks now, there's a big tourism business about the Andy Griffith Show now, with everybody making the pilgrimage to Mount Airy, North Carolina, Andy Griffith's hometown. And a lot of people think that the Andy Griffith Show was based on Mount Airy, North Carolina. But was it really? This next story here, called The Real Mayberry, has some interesting information that might make you think twice about that. Check this out. This is The Real Mayberry.
When you think about the good old days, back to simpler times and living, is there any place more ideal to live and raise a family than that of Mayberry from the Andy Griffith Show? Indeed, during the 1960s, the show was the #1 show in the nation, as Americans dreamed of a simpler life and the slower pace offered by Mayberry. Although the show ended in 1968, its appeal has continued to inspire folks to dream of living or visiting Mayberry for the past 50 years. Nowadays, fans of the Andy Griffith Show can make the pilgrimage to Mount Airy, North Carolina, to visit the modern-day Mayberry. That's right, Andy was born here, and many folks contend that Mount Airy was the Mayberry in the TV show. In fact, local politicians and businessmen have been quick to capitalize on this belief. And starting back in the 1980s, they turned Mount Airy into the fictional town of Mayberry. Heck, you can tour the town in the backseat of Andy's sheriff's car, have lunch at restaurants served by Aunt Bee lookalikes. You can take photos with the statue of Andy and Opie, tour the replica Mayberry courthouse, and even get a haircut at Floyd's barbershop. It's just like you're visiting the real Mayberry. Or is it? Now wait a minute now. What if I was to tell you the real Mayberry was actually about 20 minutes up the road, just across the Virginia state line, in a little place called Mayberry, Virginia? That's right. And with that, my friends, this is the true story of the real Mayberry. story begins in 1679, where census records note that a man named Francis Mayberry migrated from England to rural Virginia. Now, Francis settled the area and his descendants would remain in this isolated area of the Appalachian Mountains for generations. By 1792, one of his dependents named Isaac Mayberry obtained a land grant for 183 acres in an area situated on a creek that was named Mayberry Creek. The area was situated on two rugged early roads. One road went south into North Carolina, and the other would be eventually transformed into the Blue Ridge Parkway. At its peak, Mayberry consisted of about 50 farm families for a total of about 300 residents. The area had all the basic needs of life. Each family farmed buckwheat and corn and other staple crops. A man named Ed Mayberry built a mill on the creek, where all families would mill their corn and process the surrounding forest and the lumber for their homes and churches, schools, and businesses. By the early 1800s, Mayberry had a general store and it also served as their post office for the town. These rural farmers lived a simple, peaceful life for the next 150 years, isolated deep in the Appalachian Mountains. They didn't have any money. Heck, most families might be lucky to see an annual income of about $50 a year. In their minds, selling a hog or a calf for $5 or a bushel of chestnuts for 50 cents was like winning the lottery. The cliche of a family farm was a reality here since everyone took part, including the kids. It's right, there was never-ending work on the farm. Everyone worked sun up to sundown, including the mother, when she wasn't busy having other kids. By the 1930s, while America was devastated from the Great Depression, folks in Mayberry never knew when it started or when it ended. They were truly independent people. However, in 1936, the Blue Ridge Parkway was built and tore right through the middle of the town of Mayberry. Many families lost their home and had to move down the mountain to a larger town. Folks viewed it as a sad day each time a family would leave Mayberry in exchange for a life of labor in a cotton mill or a furniture factory. Yet, folks continued to leave Mayberry, and by the 1960s, only a few families were left, along with the Mayberry Creek and General Store. Coincidentally, a new TV show took America by storm in the 1960s. That's right, the Andy Griffith Show, which took place in what was supposed to be a fictional town named Mayberry. Wait a minute, hold on now. Was it really fictional? Consider this fact. Andy Griffith's grandparents lived in Mayberry, Virginia during the early 1900s. And even today, there are still surviving records from the Mayberry General Store showing them doing business there for years. Heck, Andy's mother was born near Mayberry and is buried right outside of the town. On top of that, local residents of Mayberry, Virginia all recall the characters of the Andy Griffith Show, like Otis, the town drunk, or Ernest T. Bass. Heck, locals of Mayberry could remember the real-life versions of these characters visiting the Mayberry General Store for years. Now, as folks left Mayberry, they moved to other towns in the area for paying jobs. Places like Mount Airy, North Carolina, which is about 20 minutes away from Mayberry. And that, my friends, is where Andy was born. Like I said, when the Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, politicians and business owners in Andy's hometown looked to cash in on the show's popularity and attract tourism to Mount Airy. So they rebranded the entire town as Mayberry. Now, due to his business relationships and investments in Mount Airy, Andy wouldn't in public admit that the show was based on Mayberry, Virginia. Yet, surely Andy knew that his mother and his grandparents were from Mayberry, Virginia. Even the actress who played Barney Fife's girlfriend, Thelma Lou, visited the real Mayberry, as she put it, to see it with my own eyes. So, my friends, if you ever find yourself in Mount Airy, North Carolina, touring all the Andy Griffith Show tourist attractions, do yourself a favor. Take the short 20-minute drive up to the top of Mayberry Mountain. Turn left on Mayberry Church Road, and there you can stop and shop at Mayberry General Store, built in 1892. The same store that Andy's mother and his grandparents shopped at. The store where the real characters from the Andy Griffith Show lived out their lives in Mayberry, Virginia.
Hey guys, JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller.
and today we are in the town of Mayberry, Virginia. Now, if you are an Andy Griffin fan, this is the name of the town. This is where they got the town. They got the name Mayberry from right here in Virginia. And we're here at the Mayberry Trading Post that was built in 1892. So, really cool old store in the middle of nowhere. Let's go inside and check it out, okay? So, I've finished with this, in the words of one of my heroes, Paul Harvey. And now you know the rest of the story.
Hey guys, JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to me pick this guitar just a little bit and tell you some stories behind the stories. Now we're ready for our feature presentation tonight. And my friends, this is probably the most powerful story that I've ever told on the Appalachian Storyteller. Get your Kleenex ready for this one. You might need it.
The red ball of the sun dropped behind the summit of the great bald mountain. In the doorway of the ancient log cabin, by the side of the stony road that wound upward towards the gap, sat Granny Tollet. In the room behind her was her granddaughter of about 18 years, and she was humming a ballad as she washed the supper dishes. "Them clouds forebodes falling weather, Dilsey," mumbled the grandmother, as a gust rattled the dry bean pods that swung from the porch rafters. "Yes, Granny," replied the girl, coming to the door. "I've been listening to the wind roaring like big waters." After Dilsey finished washing the dishes, she drew a chair next to her grandmother, and the two sat for some time in silence, gazing out across the mountain ridges towards the fiery sunset. Truth be told, though, it wasn't the glory of the dying day, nor the beauty of the tinted ridge tops that had drawn Granny Tollet to her usual seat on the porch of that ancestral cabin. This evening, just like every other summer day, her gaze roamed no farther than the grassy meadow across the road. Silhouetted against the flaming western skyline stood a crudely carved slab of brownish stone with a tiny picket fence enclosure. The fence was a dingy yellow and interlaced with wild honeysuckle. The slab marked the head of a vine-tangled grave, and it was no longer upright and tilted at an angle. "I'm afraid your pa's rock's gonna blow clear down on the next big wind, honey," said the old woman. "I've been planning for a while for me and you to get out there and fix it up. I'll help you whenever you say, but Granny, I wish we could sell a calf or something and put up a store-bought stone in place of that homemade one," replied the girl. "Look at here, Missy," retorted her grandmother tartly. "Whatever put such a crazy idea in your head? Didn't I take the horse and sled that rock down from the quarry? Didn't I fashion it with your granddad's cold chisel and carve the writing on it with my own hand? Sure, Granny, I know that, but it gives me the creeps to sit here every night and to look at them words on it. What's the matter with them words, gal? Ain't they the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Here lays Tom Tollet on the spot where he was murdered by the devil, John Cutshaw. Ain't that the God's truth? Yes, Granny, it's the truth. I know, but what's the good of putting it where we've got to look at it for every day of our life? Paul's dead and gone, and John Cutshaw, he's been in the pen for 5 years now. Child, I want you to think about it all of your days. You're the only child my son ever had, and your mama died the night you was born, and he shot your daddy down right there in that meadow. I took you in and I raised you, and I put up that monument stone, and I graved it that way so you could never forget. The girl made no reply. The years of stern tutelage and the lonely cabin had taught her the submission that is the highest virtue of childhood in the mountains. Granny turned to her granddaughter. Honey, go fetch the lantern and let's brighten up while we're sitting. There's a big revival starting tomorrow night at the church. Well, I'm glad there'll be something to do, replied Dilsey with a glimmer of interest. It won't be so lonesome like. Suddenly, Dilsey stepped to the edge of the porch and she leaned against the rustic handrail. Listen, Granny, there's somebody riding up this way. I hear horses' hooves on the rocks. Oh, it's probably some feller over there on Turkey Tail going through the gap, I reckon, surmised her Granny. And within a few minutes, a horseman came into view and he tied his horse at the gate. Why, it's Mosley Riddle, Dilsey whispered as her young eyes recognized the rider. Howdy, folks, came a neighborly greeting out of the dusk. Tolerable, said Granny. How's yourself? Lighten up and come on in. No, ma'am, much obliged. I just rode by to ask if you heard the news. What news? Both women asked at once. John Cutshaw's out. Oh, goodness, no, Mosey. You know he ain't, shouted Granny, and the lantern fell from her hands to the floor. Yes, Miss Tollett, I got it straight from Lawyer Benson, down in town this morning. But Mosey, he was set up for life, and he ain't been there but 5 years next month. Well, anyhow, he's out, repeated Mosey. The governor signed his pardon on Tuesday, and they say he's headed for home. I know you uns wouldn't like to hear it, but I thought you ought to know. Well, I'll be plugging along. It looks like it's going to storm some. Stunned by the news, the women sat without speaking a word for some time. Granny finally broke the silence. Dilsey, there'll be trouble in Thundering Creek account of this. I can't figure it out, though. How would any governor turn loose a man like that? John Cutshaw's got rich kin out in flat country, Granny. There ain't hardly nothing folks can't do if they've got money, replied the girl. Listen, Dilsey, with a ring of decision in her voice. Run and get the old hunting horn, the one your grandpa used to bear hunt with. Dilsey returned in a moment with a great brass ox horn of remarkable length and size. Granny said, Here, take it, honey. You're big and stout in your chest. Blow 4 long toots like you were calling for the bear dogs. Then wait a minute and blow 4 more. Do it 3 times that way. The young girl obeyed, and she put all her strength into deep-throated blast that shrilled through the valley in the dusk, above the noise of the wind and the pines. The echoes floated back, wave on wave. That'll fetch 'em, declared Granny as the reverberations died down. The boys will be coming in a hurry, hearing their paw's old hunting horn. It ain't been blowed since the day John Cutshaw killed your paw. The twilight faded swiftly into darkness on a moonless night. An hour after the great horn had sounded, a hound dog that laid at Granny's feet arose and sent up a long howl that silenced the whippoorwills. The sounds of horses echoed like thunder. And within a few minutes, 4 horsemen were dismounting at the gate. Amid the nickering of horses and the yapping of hounds, these 4 horsemen owned much of Thundering Creek Valley, but they dominated all of it. Each ruled his household with a hand of iron, according to the code of the mountains. But each one knew to mind his maw as implicitly in manhood as he had done when he was a small boy. Here we are, Ma. What's happened? Called the eldest son, John, as he looped his bridle rein over the gatepost. Plenty's happened, replied his mother, as all 4 sons filed into the cabin. I don't like to tell you, but you've got to know. The governor's pardoned John Cutshaw, and he's coming back here tomorrow, like it or not. A low growl of rage rumbled in the shadowy room, like the first distant tones of thunder. I knowed there was trouble when I heard Paul's old horn, But I never expected anything like this. I've got just one thing to say, remarked the quietest son, Rudy. If the law can't keep him out of this cove, I got something that can, with his right hand resting on a huge pistol strapped to his side. Rudy, now you're talking, exclaimed Jim Red, the youngest of the four men. If we'd had the spirit and the spunk that we ought to, John Cutshaw would already be put where no governor on earth could turn him out. I told you when all this happened that letting rattlesnakes and Cutshaws live was bad business. It's the living gospel, echoed Coy. We was looking to the law and the government for justice, and they've done us like dirt. If Ewins will stand by me, we'll put that scoundrel in a hole a lot tighter and a darker place than them state convict mines before tomorrow night. I'll stand by you till the end, vowed Jim Red. If the court can't give us no satisfaction for Tom's killing, his blood brothers will get satisfaction. Hear you boys. Their mother's thin voice rang out sharply. Shut up, every one of you. You're barking and snapping like a passel of wolves. Now, Ma, protested Red Jim hotly, you shut us down from doing anything 5 years ago. We can't just sit still and let that scoundrel strut up and down this holler like he owned it. You know that Cutshaw tribe. They ain't good for nothing. Now, Ewins, quit your jawing and listen. The mother's eyes flashed, and her words cracked like a whip. Don't none of you feel worse towards them Cutshaws than I do. I've prayed to God to let me see that man lying cold and dead with a bullet through his heart. But I know, and you know, it ain't right, and you ain't gonna do no killing. But Ma, yelled out John, that's what you said before, and look where it got us. Thundering Creek ain't no safe place for nobody with him running loose. Now, don't give your Ma none of that back talk, John. I know as well as you that ridding this coal of that reptile would make everybody on Thundering Creek draw their breath a lot easier. But you boys ain't gonna do it. None of our family has blood on their hands, and you ain't gonna stain them now. The discussion was ended, for now at least. The desperate rage of the brothers had spent itself since the men would obey their mother's wishes. And as the men mounted their horses to depart, their ma shouted, the thing for all you to do is to tend to your own business and keep from crossing that man's path all you can. Me and Dilsey's aim to go to the revival meeting tomorrow night, and I'd be proud if Ewins would come. I'd like to see all of you profess to the Lord before I'm called home.
I've been on this gospel way for many, many days. But I know it won't be long till I am gone.
The next day, Reverend Thomas, a giant of a man with a voice like thunder, sat on a wooden chair behind a rudely crafted pulpit in a small mountain Baptist church. He was thumbing through the pages back and forth, deep in the throes of thought, looking for a text to speak to him. The mountain preacher looked up at the door, and in walked Granny Tollett and Dilsey through the front door of the church. The two women took their usual seats, and behind them, with a certain awkwardness, 4 men in heavy boots entered noisily. The congregation looked around with a mild surprise. You see, the Tollett boys hadn't darkened the church door since anybody could remember. Outside the church, the air was heavy, and storm clouds lingered on the horizon. Granny Collett's fallen weather prediction was true. Occasional lightning flashes filled the dim-lit church with dazzling whiteness, after which the tiny oil lamps in the wall brackets glowed a sickly yellow again. By now, the news of the sudden release of John Cutshaw had spread far and wide throughout Thundering Creek Valley. Reverend Thomas surmised that the release of Cutshaw and the unusual presence of Granny Tollett's sons in church were surely connected. Once the singing choir had scattered to their seats, the Reverend stood behind the pulpit and he launched into his hastily prepared sermon. Vengeance is mine, he shouted in a booming voice. I will repay, saith the Lord. They's folks in this house tonight that's got good reasons for craving vengeance. That's human nature, and there's a heap of it in us mountain folks. Not one of the Tollett boys so much as blinked an eye. The preacher continued. This is the good book talking tonight, talking a lot louder than that wind a-roaring out yonder, and that thunder a-popping. Now, Granny Tollett, you've had more to bear than most anybody. You've heard the blood of your firstborn calling from the ground, and God Almighty knows how loud it calls. But these here words were meant for you and your boys. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Suddenly, something cracked in the distance. It was too short and sharp for thunder, and mountain men have a keen ear for sounds like that. It came again, nearer and nearer. There was no mistake about it. Any man in the room could tell you what that sound was, even the caliber of the pistol that made it. Then again, 6 shots rang out, followed by the clatter of hooves on stones. Coming around the bend of the road dashed a dozen hard-ridden horses, pounding through the darkness. Just the instant they passed in front of the church, lightning flashed and illuminated the men's faces. There he was, leading the pack of men, Calico Dick, known everywhere through Thundering Creek as the father of John Cutshaw. The entire Cutshaw clan was roaring past the church with the newly released John Cutshaw. Protected in the center of their posse, all of the Tollett boys pulled their pistols and headed for the door to confront him. When Granny Tollett's voice rang out, "Boys, if you ain't got no respect for the preacher or no fear for the Lord, surely you gotta mind your maw, and I say sit down." Sulkily, the big men faced about and took their seats. The next day, the rumor of the Cutshaws riding through Thundering Creek spread through the valley on swift wings. At Beckley's corn mill, it was the talk of the day. "It's a plumb outrage," shouted one man. "Them Tollett boys have taken too much. They kept their hands off and they let the law handle John when a lot of folks would have saved the state the cost of trying that feller and then feeding him and clothing him. But after last night, nobody could blame the boys for killing him." Suddenly one man spoke up. "I heard John Cutshaw was sick, powerful sick, and that's why the governor pardoned him. They say all that work in them prison mines gave him the sickness." The owner of the mill spoke up. "All pooh. That's just a Cutshaw lie. The way they came tearing through here last night, no, that don't fit with a tale like that. I'm just telling you what I was told. They said once John got home last night, they put him in the bed, and they say he won't ever get out of that bed either." Before the day was over, word had spread all over. John Cutshaw had been sent home from the state convict mines to die in his native mountains. Granny Tollett was sitting in her chair on a porch when she heard the news. She gazed out towards her son's tombstone, and she said, "It don't seem hardly right for him to die all peaceful in a bed, but at least it won't be so hard to hold my boys back now, because I've been scared they're going to kill him." The revival continued at the church for the next 2 weeks, but Grandma Tollett hadn't went back, and one day the preacher showed up at her cabin to talk the conditions over. Now, Granny's stubbornness was famous and well known throughout the mountains, and when the preacher arrived, he found her sitting in her chair on the porch with her Bible in her hand. "Sister Tollett," he began, "if everybody was pondering the book the way you're doing, there'd be souls born every night." Granny replied, "You can just take a seat. I assure you, there ain't gonna be no outpouring during our meeting, as long as there's an unpunished murderer running loose within a mile of your church, and there ain't gonna be no work of grace happening anytime soon." "Miss Tollett," the preacher interrupted, "I can't blame you for having hard feelings against John Cutshaw, but I'm going to tell you something you ought to know. I'm feeling called to tell you." "Oh, you say your say," she responded. She closed her Bible and she pushed her spectacles back on her white temples. "I've been to see John. His mother sent for me this morning. When I got there, he was laying on his bed. Oh, I wouldn't have known him. He ain't more than a shadow of himself. His face was white as the pillar case, except for where the coal dust remains underneath his skin. He's in deep trouble. He admitted that he's been a terrible and wicked man, and that in his time he ought to have been hung. Why didn't he tell you something we don't already know?" Granny replied, "Well, I seen he was under powerful conviction, and it was hard on him. I asked him why he couldn't just go on and let go and pass on to the other side, when finally he told me what was holding him back." The preacher paused. "Well, go on, I'm hearing you," Granny replied. "He said they told him what was written on your son Tom's stone that you made, and them words keep arising between him and his maker. Ain't them words true?" Granny shouted. "Oh, no, I ain't saying they ain't, sister. I'm only telling you that they're rising up like a cloud in the face of a man that's trying to crawl back from the door of hell. Well, there ain't nothing I can do about it. He killed my boy, and I engraving that rock just like it was. What I've wrote is what I wrote. and that's in the good book too. Miss Tollett, the pastor softened his voice, I didn't come here to argue with you. You're a good woman, and you bore a heap in your time. You kept your boys from violence, and you saved John Cutshaw's body from being full of bullet holes. I'm asking you, would you do anything to save his soul? Granny leaned forward in her chair, and she gripped her old Bible tightly in her hands. No, I won't. That's asking too much, preacher. I'm willing to let him die in his bed, but he'll have to take what's coming to him after that and do his own dickering with God Almighty. With fire in her eyes, she watched as the preacher disappeared around the bend of the road. A few moments later, Dilsey returned from the orchard with an apron full of apples. I'm needing you, Dilsey. Fetch that bucket of whitewash and a brush. We've fooled along long enough about fixing up your papa's grave. Let's go and do it right now. Underneath the sultry afternoon sun, the mountain girl and her grandmother dug and shoveled the stony clay around the base of the leaning stone. A little while later, when the women were through with their task, and at last the tombstone stood once again erect, it was flaunting its damning legend in the faces of passers-by. Granny, you need to sit down and rest, said Dilsey. Quit pestering me. I ain't ailing, she snapped. But she wouldn't sit down, and she roamed through the 3 rooms of the cabin restlessly. She grabbed a bucket of beans and she headed for the porch, and she began stringing the pods for drying. But suddenly, she rose from her chair as if she was startled. She scattered the beans everywhere. She went and she grabbed a hoe and she started climbing the steep path towards the corn patch above the orchard. Granny, you'll get a sunstroke, cried Dilsey. Leave me alone, I tell you. I'm needing a stir. For 2 hours, she swung that hoe like she was killing snakes. Back in the kitchen, Dilsey could hear that hoe hitting the flinty gravel. By sunset, exhausted in body and spirit, Granny limped back to the cabin. She left her supper untasted, and she changed into her church dress and said, Dilsey, come on, honey. Let's hit the trail for preaching tonight. It's the last night of the revival. Reverend Thomas was in perfect form that night. The sermon was just a variation on the never-failing theme, the terrors of Judgment Day. Where are you going to be, sinner? Where are you aiming to hide yourself that day when the mountains are a-burning, and the sea is a-boiling, and the sun is a-darkening, and the moon's a-bleeding, and the stars are a-falling? Folks, he went on, I sat today at the bedside of a murderer. He took the life of a man who had done no wrong to him. For 5 years, he's been enduring torment. He's been shut up in a black pit way underneath a mountain, digging in the dark like a mole. And now, the cold hand of death is laying upon him, choking the breath out of him, until he can no longer raise his head off a pillar. He's about to go down a more darker pit than any coal mine, and there ain't nary a streak of light. The listeners in the audience grew tense. The shuffling of boots on the floor ceased. A creaking church pew became still. But listen, people, there's way worse things than killing a man's body. There's such a thing of standing in the way of a dying man making his peace with a great judge, and that's murdering a man's soul and sending him straight to hell. There was a sudden stir, and the sound of hard heels hitting the floor heading for the back door caused everybody to crane their necks to see who was leaving. The preacher paused. Sister Tollett, I'd be right proud if you stayed. But Granny kept on walking. I'm going home, slamming the church door behind her. Up the rough trail to the cabin, Granny Tollett walked fast and resolutely. She took off her bonnet to catch in her face the night breeze that was coming down from the mountain gap. Not once in the stiff climb did she stop to catch her breath. Once she reached her gate, she walked right past her house, and she unlatched the door of the lean-to shed. Within a moment, she emerged with a great sledgehammer that her husband had used long ago at his forge. She crossed the road and the creek, and she clambered over the pasture fence, and she trudged across the grassy meadow. Finally, she arrived, and she planted her feet at the head of her son's grave. She began hammering the face of the chiseled stone. Her slight frame staggered under the weight of each blow of the sledgehammer. Her breath panted stronger, and she sobbed with every blow. A dozen more clanging blows, and the whole stone was crisscrossed with cracks. Suddenly, it fell to pieces, splintered into 1,000 shapeless chips. Her panting sobs turned into a cry. Oh, Tommy boy, you understand, don't you? I'm going to put you up one of those pretty store-bought stones of remembrance here. like your baby girl has been begging me to." She was completely wore out, and she collapsed beside her son's grave. And that night, John Cutshaw died.